That's good. Yeah, please. All right, class. Good to see you all here. Are we ready? Sharon, you ready? John, you ready? Okay, hi everybody. I am Harvey Sluggo Wasserman. I do the Sluggo because of Harvey Weinstein. I just had enough after that. I have taught history many, many years, U.S. history in particular. And during my graduate school career in the 1960s, I was at the University of Chicago for the Chicago Convention. And I decided that in the light of everything that was happening, I would write my own history of the United States. I was very humble at the time, still am actually. And I came across a book called The Contours of American History by William Appleman Williams, who was a great socialist at the University of Wisconsin. And he had a theory of cycles, and I kind of ripped it off. And I've been working with it ever since. It made a lot of sense to me. And then I went to a hippie farm. I lived in western Massachusetts from 1968 to 1984. And I was writing, I decided to write, I was going to write the whole history of the United States, but I fell into a kind of a rabbit hole between 1860 and 1920 and felt very, very comfortable there. And I wrote about 300 pages about that, the socialists, the Wobblies, the robber barons, the whole deal. And I was sending it around, and the publishers were telling me to drop dead and never send him anything else again. But I sent one copy to Howard Zinn, the great Howard Zinn. Does everybody know who Howard Zinn was? And he wrote me back on a yellow piece of paper, a one-sheet letter saying he liked the book and he hoped it would get published. And so I showed this. Come on up here if you would. Come on all the way up. And thank you. I do that to all my classes. I like to have proximity here, you know. So Howard, I showed the book, the letter that he wrote me, and Harper and Row, the head of Harper and Row, said, we don't understand your book at all. Makes no sense whatsoever to us. But if you'll get Howard Zinn to write the introduction, we'll publish it. And so he did. And the book sold 30,000 copies. It was amazing. And then, but I kept that letter. And I have that letter still from 1970, this letter from Howard Zinn. And I just turned over all my papers to the University of Massachusetts. And that letter that he sent me, thank you very much. Thank you. You can see it online, actually, this letter that Howard wrote me in 1970. So never, ever hesitate to do a good deed. Because Howard then hooked up with Harper and Row, and they published his People's History of the United States in 1979, and it sold 2 million copies. So I hope Howard got at least $1 a copy. You know, that would be great. So at any rate, using this theory of cycles, I am going to now explain. I chose 54 minutes because most classes on the university level are 50 minutes, and then the professor usually goes over, and you don't want to go over more than 5 minutes. So and whenever I go over when I teach a 50-minute class, I make sure I don't go more than 54 minutes. So I'm going to now use this cycles theory and a theory of historical DNA to explain all of U.S. history in 54 minutes or less. So, and I've never done this. I did this once before, actually, and it was at a pagan gathering in Ohio. And it was a clothing optional gathering, so I had a group of about 10 people, and half of them were not wearing clothes. So if I designate 5 of you to take off your clothes, it'll be very comfortable. I had mine on, but you know, I'm 72. We don't go clothing optional anymore, or as they call it, sky-clad. Okay, here we go. So the United States of America has lived its life pretty much in a vacuum. We, in this country, had the Atlantic on the right side and the Pacific on the left, and Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. We would have conquered both Canada and Mexico if we had the wherewithal, but we didn't, thankfully. Although we did take about half of Mexico in the 1840s. But so as a result of this, our organism, the United States of America, we have to look at it as a separate organism that grew up and had a life. We were conceived in 1688. We were born in 1776. We had a youthful adolescence, which was called Manifest Destiny. We had a late adolescence, which was called Bully Manhood by Theodore Roosevelt. We came to full adulthood, and we really fulfilled all our national karma in 1945 after we defeated the Axis, blew up the atomic bomb, achieved full prosperity, actually full employment, and had a economic bill of rights, which unfortunately was not made into law. In after 1945, we had a kind of got into a bad mood and did the ridiculous Cold War. And then in 1960, we elected a bright young man, and we appeared to be headed towards a nice late adulthood, early old age, until John Kennedy was killed. And with the killing of John Kennedy, we went into a midlife crisis and really have never emerged from it. And then we proceeded to age very ungracefully, and we had a national senility beginning in 1981 with Ronald Reagan. And then by 1992, with the advent of the internet and the terrible presidency of Bill Clinton, basically American democracy, along with Soviet communism, dropped dead. And since 1992, our basic corpse of American democracy has been on life support. We've been on basically a coma through the presidencies of Clinton, Obama, Clinton, Bush II, Obama, and now, of course, the Trumpocalypse, which is the end of our empire and the end of our existence as a separate country and as a democracy. Given the internet and what else has happened worldwide since the 1990s, we are no longer really separate from the world situation, the world community, and our organism as a whole has been integrated into the global reality. So that's our process as an organism. Now, when we were conceived from 1492 onward, we basically formed that organism with two strands of DNA, and here they are. I don't know how well you can see this, but on the one hand, you have the indigenous. Now, the indigenous population of America, of North America, is not dealt with by mainstream historians. If very best, even in the liberal books, they talk about the Indians being here and being wiped out and how terrible that all was, and we're sorry for that. The conservatives say the Indians were here, they were inferior, it was our destiny to wipe them out, and to hell with them. And you will never see even a liberal book about American history giving full credit to the impact on our national DNA of the indigenous culture. And reality is that the indigenous, the Iroquois in particular, who are also known as the Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse, formed the first true democracy in North America, and in fact, the Iroquois Confederacy was the most advanced democracy in the history of the world, with the formation of the country, of their confederacy in 1140. They had a holy man. His name was Daganoweda. And I have a book coming out. I'm actually writing this all up. My history book is going to be called The Life and Death Spiral of U.S. History, from Daganoweda to the Trumpocalypse. So it covers the whole thing. Daganoweda was a holy man. We don't know if he was a real human being or a spirit, or both. But what was happening was the 5 tribes of what is now upstate New York, the Mohawk going across from Albany to Buffalo, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, were all at war with each other. And they're absolutely ferocious. You did not want to get captured by the Iroquois. They were into torture, they were into cannibalism, they were really, really rough, and they were unbeatable. They were the best warriors you could ever encounter in the North American forest land in what's now upstate New York. So Daganoweda encountered a guy named Hiawatha, a chief in the forest. And Hiawatha was a great speaker. Daganoweda was a stutterer. Hiawatha was in the woods mourning the death of his wife and family, 3 daughters, which is pretty rare. Very rarely in any indigenous warfare were children killed, or women, actually. Usually it was between the men, and the women were, when they were captured, were integrated into the tribe. But according to legend, Hiawatha's wife and children were killed. Daganoweda said, look, I can't speak, I'm a stutterer, you're a great speaker. Let's go around to the tribes and we'll form a union so that they stop killing each other. And that's what they did. The date of it is in dispute. It's either 1140 or 1540. They know it was on an eclipse, so they actually know the month, day, and year, the month and day, but the year is in dispute. There's a 400-year gap there. But they formed an incredibly advanced democracy. The Iroquois Confederacy in this period of time was the most advanced democracy in any place on earth. This is a time when Europe is just barely emerging from the Middle Ages. You've got these kings, you've got torture, you've got all these totally backwards tyrants running around Europe and Asia. And here in North America, we had a democracy. Each of the 5 tribes chose its chiefs. They went to a confederacy meeting, usually in the Onondaga Territory in the middle of upstate New York. And they made decisions, and they had a Bill of Rights, actually. They had a Bill of Rights that had 113 what are called codicils, much more detailed than our Bill of Rights, although our Bill of Rights was a great doctrine. And there were strict limitations on the power of the Confederacy and of the tribes. And the distinguishing feature, the main distinguishing feature of the Haudenosaunee culture and of the 5 tribes was that they were matriarchies. They were run by the women. The women grew the food in the gardens. They took care of the children. They maintained the longhouses. And the men went out and they hunted and they fished and they sat around and shot the shit, all through the winter. And I saw a beautiful documentary about the Haudenosaunee. And a tribal woman was asked, her name was Audrey Shenandoah, and she was asked why it was that if the women ran the tribes, the men were the chiefs. And she said, well, it gives them something to do and it makes them feel important. So that was the explanation. But this was definitely a matriarchal society. And when the whites came here, they were confronted with this confederacy that was militarily unbeatable. Nobody could even come close to beating the Iroquois. The only way they were going to defeat them, and the French came first. The French actually liked the Iroquois. As opposed to the British. The Spaniards weren't up there. But the French fell in love with the Iroquois. There's a famous quote from a French philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Anybody know what it is? Man is born free and everywhere is in chains. And when he said born free, he was talking about the Indians. When he said in chains, he was talking about the Europeans. And so the main inspiration since Greece, which, the Greeks had slaves and women were inferior, held inferior in the Greek culture. They did have a limited democracy. The Iroquois Confederacy was not limited. Women had full rights and beyond that, and they voted, and there were no slaves. They did put captured people into their tribes, but they were not enslaved. So the Iroquois Confederacy is the inspiration for American democracy. And it is still part of our DNA. The Iroquois, all the native tribes, had this in common. They were matriarchies. They honored nature. They felt they're not separate from nature. They were tolerant. They were sexually tolerant. There were gay people in the Indian tribes were just considered regular members of the community. They also practiced abortion, by the way. If a woman wanted to get rid of a pregnancy, she did it herbally. The man had nothing to do about it. Donald Trump was not out there trying to revoke Roe v. Wade. They didn't need it. It was just a basic piece of the way of life. They also had vision questing. They did various substances. In the Southwest, of course, they used peyote. There's not much evidence of smoking pot, by the way. We don't see that, and we don't see much tie-dye among the earlier Indians, but or indigenous. I like to use the term indigenous there. So and terminology is important. I was teaching at a school in Central Ohio, and the leader, the head of the Museum of the Native American, of the American Indian, it's called the Museum of the American Indian, on the Smithsonian Mall in Washington, came to my school. And he's an indigenous lawyer. He's dressed in a three-piece suit, but I think he was a Navajo. And I asked him, what does it feel like to have you finally get in a museum of the native peoples? What does it feel like to have it called the Museum of the American Indian? And he said, and this is so typical, humor is a big part of indigenous culture. He said to me, "We like being called Indians. It reminds us that Columbus was lost." So that was a great line, So they were here, and you will never hear in a mainstream American textbook any deference given to the influence of indigenous culture on our current being. But the fact of the matter is, and this is a major contention that I have, that the indigenous DNA is still very much with us. The force for matriarchy, the belief in the oneness of humankind with nature, the dominance ultimately of women, the sexual freedom. There were none of this monogamous stuff in the Iroquois. Among the Iroquois, if a woman wanted to divorce her husband, if they had gone through having a marriage, she just took his stuff and threw it out of the longhouse. So if a guy went off hunting and he was married and came back and he saw his boots by the fire, he had to go live with his mother. And the children were actually not raised by the biological fathers. The children were raised by the mothers and her brother and her brothers and her grandfather, along with the other women. The biological father was not the chief caregiver and did not have custody over the children in North America. Now, there were differences in the Central and South American tribes, but the point of the matter is that we are still very much possessed by a certain DNA from our indigenous ancestors. And never underestimate that. They have not gone away. This Dakota pipeline fight, Winona LaDuke, the indigenous culture is still very much a part of American culture. And thank God, or the goddess, or Manitou, or whatever else you want to call it. And of course, in the 1960s, which is an incredible piece of our cycles of history, there was this idea that the hippies had come from the Hopi. Had anybody heard that? There was allegedly a Hopi prophecy. This was talked about many times under the influence of cannabis, that, hey man, did you know that hippie comes from Hopi, and that there was a prophecy that someday there would be a generation of whites who would revive the indigenous culture, right? I happen to believe that, as a matter of fact. I did my share, more than my share of cannabis. I took peyote a couple of times. I did LSD and all those mushrooms, and by God, I think that's 100% true. And if you go to various pagan festivals and Burning Man and I was at I remember going to Woodstock the second time. I don't know about the first time. I don't remember, but this is definitely part of our culture. Never. What's that? The Rainbow Gathering. Yes. Never underestimate the residual, the ongoing, the very vibrant impact of indigenous culture on our current culture. And this is part of my cycles of theory here, history theory, and I'm going to explain all of U.S. history in another 40 minutes, is that we have a cyclical back and forth. In 1630, this bozo on the right in the black head, the Puritans came here. Now, Columbus and the Spaniards, they were brutal. They were terrible, terrible, terrible treatment of the indigenous culture. Christopher Columbus was such a bad guy that he came here 4 times. On the 3rd time, he was so brutal to the Indians that they actually arrested him. The Spaniards arrested Christopher Columbus and sent him back to Spain in chains because he had done such terrible things to the indigenous. There was no sense among most of the Spanish that the indigenous had any kind of human presence, even in a Christian view, that could be viewed with any kind of respect. Now, there was a controversy. There was a priest named Bartolomé de las Casas who was horrified by what the Spaniards were doing. He actually wrote up a manuscript, and the king got it. And since we're in LA, I have to mention this. There was a trial in Madrid about how the Spanish conquistadors were treating the Indians. And de las Casas, this priest said, come on, man, we're Christians. We're doing terrible things to these people. It's not justified. These are God's children. And there was a guy who was on the other side. And you know what his name was? Sepulveda. When you drive on Sepulveda, that street is named after the guy who defended the conquistadors' maltreatment of the Indians. It's completely changed my view of driving on Sepulveda. I'm very uncomfortable on it, but you know how the 405 is. So, at any rate, so the Spaniards never really repented for what they did to the indigenous, and the English came here, and these guys, the Puritans, were absolutely horrible, and this is the other strand of our DNA. So this theory is based on two strands of DNA that go back and forth. The indigenous on the one side and the Puritan on the other. The Puritans were the worst of the Christians, so-called Christians. They came here with this view that they were superior to anybody who wasn't a Puritan. That included, by the way, Catholics, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses who came later. Anybody who wasn't a Puritan in their view was going to hell. And hell was a very, very tangible place. And these people also believed, and this has plagued us ever since, that money, the accumulation of money, was an indication that you were one of God's chosen. And that if you were really, really rich, you were probably going to heaven. It wasn't a guarantee that you were going to go to heaven. These people were crazy. They believed in predestination. They believed that that God had decided, and God, of course, was a really authoritarian, masculine dictator. God really did not. He wanted you to toe the line. You couldn't even think about sex outside of marriage. Within marriage, you could not vary from the missionary position. In Boston, I won't be more explicit, I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. In Boston, they had spies who were self-appointed spies who would go around and look in the windows of married couples. And if they saw that this married couple was doing other than the missionary position, they were reported. Can you imagine that? And they elected their priests after the previous priest died, but that once the priest was elected, he, and of course it was always a he, was considered divine. You could not contradict the will of the leader of the Puritan church. They were incredible racists. They would slaughter Indians and black people without even a compunction. Anyone who was non-white had zero rights in Boston. Thank God Boston. I was born in Boston. I almost wore my Red Sox hat, but you know, ironically, which has now become one of the most liberal cities in the country, it was a complete totalitarian dictatorship. In early times, you could equate it with Orwell's 1984. You could not drink for fun. Dancing was prohibited. You could sing in church as long as you sang hymnals, and that was it. And the punishments were really severe. And that part of our culture has continued. We still have that going on. We still have the evangelical right. You know, all these hypocrites. You know, every time I hear an evangelical priest denouncing gay people, I know he's gay. I mean, that's clear, right? All these guys who denounce sex outside of marriage, they always have a mistress, at least one. You know, and then they get up and they cry, and everybody forgives them and all that crap. You know, hopefully that part of it is done. But they are also. This is the root of American empire. The Puritans came here. They believed that they were going to form the city on the hill, and that was the term they used, and Reagan picked it up, of course, and that they were then going to conquer all of humankind for God and the Puritan faith. And that's a lot of where our Puritanism, our imperial imperative comes from. These guys believed that it was their God-given duty to conquer the rest of the world and to convert everybody to the Christian faith, or their brand of the Christian faith. And it was tied into wealth. They felt that if the money they made, the wealth they accumulated from conquering the rest of the world, was in fact a sign that they were divinely chosen, and that they were not, thank God, going to go to hell. So when you look for the roots, of course, American imperialism is rooted in greed and arrogance. But the arrogant side and the divine mission side comes right from the Puritans in 1630. And if you look at the kind of world they wanted, when Oliver Cromwell took over England, you know, allegedly he made it a democracy, but it was democracy only for Puritans. They could vote. Women couldn't vote. The Puritans had an interesting view of women. Women, of course, were inferior, and their duty was to serve the man and to provide the children. But they weren't sure if Puritan women had souls. They believed that in order to get into heaven and escape hell, you had to be able to read the Bible, right? But there's a whole dialogue about whether or not they should let women learn to read, because they're afraid if Puritan women actually were subject to going to heaven or hell, if they couldn't read, they were going to be wrongly subjected to hell. So they actually let Puritan women learn how to read. Not to vote, not to have any say, not to own property. The only way a woman in the early America could own property is if she inherited it from her husband. And this, by the way, is one of the roots of the witch trials. The witch trials in Salem were, of course, very rooted in the Puritan faith, but it was also about females owning property. Virtually all the women who were hung in Salem in 1692 and 93 were grandmothers who had inherited property. And the sheriff somehow, miraculously, wound up with the property of all the women who were hung, as did the neighbors. In a lot of cases, the women were hung because the neighbors coveted their property, and this was part of the Puritan belief. Those were the only women in Salem that had property. And that's all the way through. So what we have now is a back and forth in our history. And Sharon, could you do the next one, please? Thank you. Between these two basic cultural indigenous versus Puritan points of view. I guess that's a little. You get the idea, and you can see that there are bridging. For example, Ben Franklin. Now, Ben Franklin is incredibly important to all of our historical story. Okay, Ben Franklin is the guy who made the bridge in our early culture between the indigenous and the Puritan. Ben Franklin was born in Boston. He moved down to Philadelphia. He was not a Quaker. He was married, but they were never legally married, Ben and his wife. He loved women, Ben Franklin. He went to England and for 2 years when he was 18 and said he basically slept with every woman he could get his hands on. And he said he wrote a book. He was a deist, so he didn't believe in miracles, but he wrote in his book that the only miracle in his life was that he never got VD. That was Ben Franklin. You can never overestimate the genius of Ben Franklin. He is the most significant individual in all of Western history, at least since Jesus. Because he was a total genius as a scientist, and of course he discovered electricity. He invented the Franklin stove. He invented bifocals. He invented the lightning rod. And nobody even comes close to him as a scientist and an inventor. And then as a civic genius, he is unsurpassed. And of all the people in early America, there were a couple. The other was Tom Paine, and Tom Paine was actually Ben Franklin's student, his disciple. Franklin understood the genius of the indigenous culture. He actually went up and observed the meetings of the Iroquois. When he convened a Congress to pull the colonies together in Albany in 1854, he had it presided over by a Mohawk chieftain. I mean, this was unheard of. He was quoted as saying that the Iroquois Confederacy ran better than the British Parliament. And he was right, but for a white man to say that was, it was only Ben Franklin could have gotten away with that. He was the media genius of the time. He was the postmaster, which was the early internet. He had the only national publications, which is Poor Richard's Almanac, and he had various newspapers. And unlike, can you imagine, unlike the Koch brothers and all these other greed-crazed Jeff Bezos, by the age of 40, Franklin, who was extremely good with money, basically announced that he had made enough money, he was set to go for life, and he was going to devote his life to public service. And he invented the lightning rod, which is probably the most prevalent invention in human history prior to the internet. I mean, every home, every ship in the world had a lightning rod. He refused to patent it. He said, "Oh, I have enough money. I'll give it away." He invented the Franklin stove, which was really the first ecological advance of major importance, because all the houses, all the buildings had fireplaces, which are incredibly inefficient. You're just burning wood in an open fire, and then most of it goes up the chimney, and then you get smoke in the building. He invented a stove that encased the fire. He saved billions of trees and thousands, millions of lives, because people didn't get lung cancer as they were getting from the open fires. Now, the important thing, and then I'm going to jump into the cycles here, the important thing about Franklin also is that he really understood constitutional democracy. And he really understood human rights, and he was in favor of them, thankfully. And in terms of race, and this is so Franklin, he, like almost all white people, 99% of the white people in America in the early colonies were racists. It was just part of the culture. They believed that white people were superior to black people. The only exceptions were, anybody want to tell me? The Quakers. The Quakers came here. They were a sect in England. They believed in the equality of all humankind. They believed in nonviolence. Still very much with us. Still part of our indigenous DNA, the Quakers. You know, I love the Quakers, thee and thou and all that stuff, right? But Franklin was not a Quaker, but he lived in Philadelphia. And one day, and I'm sure it must have been a Quaker school, he went to a school where there were both white and black children. Now, he had 2 slaves at the time, Franklin. And he sat and he observed as a scientist. And he watched the black and the white children, and he came to the conclusion that the black kids were just as smart as the white kids. He immediately changed all his views on race and said, hey, black and white were the same. He freed his slaves, and he became an abolitionist, for God's sakes. He was the only signer of the Constitution and the Declaration to come out against slavery. The last article that he wrote in his life was he was mocking racism. You know, he had a fictional Muslim leader who was talking about how inferior the Christians were, and it was meant to be a parody of racism and the belief that Christianity was superior to other religions. Now, Franklin is incredibly important because first of all, the revolution could never have happened without Ben Franklin. He was in the Constitutional Convention, and I can tell you how it went. There were between 40 and 50 guys in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and there's no transcript. But I guarantee you what happened was that whenever there was a fight, an argument, Franklin would sit there quietly, and then at exactly the right moment, he would say exactly the right thing. And that's how the Constitution came about. It has its flaws, obviously, and then the Bill of Rights was, of course, written by Madison, but Franklin was very influential in that. So the real father of our country is Ben Franklin. He also won the revolution for us. He went over to France. The Congress sent him to France in 1777 to persuade the French to come on our side in the revolution. We couldn't have won the revolution without the French, and this is our birth. And Franklin, the poor guy, did it by sleeping with half the women in France. And even though he was 70 at the time, actually that's not quite true, but he did befriend, let's say, the most important women in France, and thereby persuaded the king to come on our side. So, let's start now. Sharon, can you change the slide? Let's see if one comes up next. No, that's not it. So what happens now is, we have this isolated entity. Yes, can you see that? Is that visible to you? Not really? Okay, I was earlier gonna, how about in color? The next one's in color. The basic reality is there. The yellow is the beginning, the cycles run in 5 phases, let's put it that way. In the beginning, you have a stasis, a period of stasis, which we did in the 1600s in America. And then there's an event that happens, and there is a powerful leader that comes forward. And there's a burst of energy. There's a time of formation, of moving ahead, of a new era in society. And then we have a period of green where we have an awakening, a springtime of new consciousness. And this is when our indigenous DNA really kicks in. And as you can see, it's happened 6 times in our history. And this is where the fun happens. This is where you have drugs, sex, and rock and roll. You have music, you have great literature, you have spiritual advancement, you have new ideas, and social justice and anti-racism. This is when all the great stuff really happens. And it accelerates our development, and then unfortunately it always ends in a war because we deal with a basic issue that comes forward. For example, in the Revolution, it was independence. We were no longer an empire. In the Civil War, we get rid of slavery. In World War I, we get screwed. We should have had a revolution, and this is a lot of what happened to our country. In World War II, we conquer fascism. before adopting it ourselves, but we get an economic bill of rights. We have full employment. We have women's rights, and all that stuff happens. And then unfortunately, we have Vietnam, and then we have the catastrophe with Reagan. And so we haven't that. But that's our red period. That's our peak. That's our hot summer. You have a winter thaw followed by a springtime awakening followed by a hot summer of war, and then afterwards you have a fall. You have a reaction period. After the Revolution, we got the Constitution. After the Civil War, we had Jim Crow and the KKK. After World War I, we have the destruction of the Socialist Party by Woodrow Wilson, who was way more repressive, by the way, than Donald Trump. Woodrow Wilson is my least favorite president. My two least favorite presidents are both Democrats, Andrew Jackson and Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a horrible, horrible dictator. And really just a terrible guy all around. After World War II, we have the Cold War. After the 1960s, we have Vietnam and then a reaction under Nixon. And then after Reagan, of course, we have our national senility. The reaction period is followed by a winter time of materialism, where people are just into money. The ideological times have passed over. People don't want to hear about social revolution. They just want to get rich, and it's a time of reaction and of stasis, really, of the McCarthy era, the Reaganites, all that stuff. So it's a clear cycle that follows the seasons of the year. Right? You start in winter, you have a springtime thaw, you have a powerful leader. In 1688, it was William of Orange. In 1828, it was Andrew Jackson. In the early 1900s, it was Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. You had the Roosevelts, and I really don't talk specifically separately about Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was inseparable from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the greatest woman of the 20th century, and without whom we wouldn't have had the New Deal and a tremendous amount of advancement. In 1960, you get John Kennedy. In 1976, you get Jimmy Carter. But by then, we're out of steam. Jimmy Carter wasn't a burst of energy. He was kind of a puff of energy. And then it should have happened again with Clinton, but it didn't. Clinton, really, in the 1990s, the American organism is pretty much done. He was a terrible president, Bill Clinton, followed by another terrible president, Bush II, followed by another terrible president, Barack Obama, and then we get to the Trumpocalypse. And you have to think of Donald Trump really as the embodiment of our entire fall of empire. You know, we whine and moan about what a terrible guy he is, and certainly he is. I never have encountered a human being that loathsome and despicable as Donald Trump. But you have to remember that this country has put other people worse than Donald Trump in power, like Pinochet, like Somoza, like Mobutu, like Marcos. Think of all the dictators that we have put in power, roll and imposed on other people, and rolled them up into one, and that's where you get Donald Trump. Donald Trump is our imperial vulture come home to roost. Someone the other day said he was our balloon payment on the empire, and so we have to think of it that way. That this is a natural progression, and we are now paying the price for our imperial Puritan arrogance of the last 300 or 400 years. Okay? So let's follow the cycles now. Think of ourselves as an organism. If you could read that. I was going to pull you out all up front. I regret now not doing it. But in the beginning, we have our infant empire. The United States of America is conceived in 1688. You had a king in England named James II, who England had become Anglican when Henry VIII wanted his eight wives. It got used to being Protestant. Elizabeth II was one of the great women in all of history. I really wish, if I could pick a woman to meet in history, I would pick Elizabeth I. I love Elizabeth. I would like to have met her before she was a virgin. That's an Oscar Levant line, by the way. Oscar Levant said that about Doris Day. Well, I knew her before she was a virgin. Elizabeth, I bet she was really hot. You know, she was quite an amazing person. She was an incredible leader, Elizabeth I. She was in power for, decades. And she's responsible for Shakespeare and the great Renaissance in England. So, but when a century later, in comes James II. He wants to make it. He was the Duke of York, by the way, and New York is named after him. He wanted to make England Catholic again. The country was not going to go for that. And so they overthrew him, and his daughter actually is Mary, who was married to William of Mary. And in 1688, you have a conversion of England to a liberal monarchy. And in America, we overthrew all his royal governors. And it was the first time the colonies acted together. So that's my view of the conception of the American organism is in 1688. And you'll be glad to know that one of the governors that we overthrew, his name was Peter Andros, and he was the governor of Boston. They threw him in jail, and they were about to hang him, and he escaped dressed as a woman, starting the great tradition of American cross-dressing, which was advanced by J. Edgar Hoover and then Rudy Giuliani. So, we like this. So, 1688 we're conceived. And then in the 1730s and 40s, there is a tremendous great awakening. This is the springtime. This is when liberal thought and cultural advancement come. This is an amazing period of time. There was a preacher in Northampton, Massachusetts, named Jonathan Edwards, and he was a Puritan. But he would preach for hours and hours and scare the hell out of people about hell, and you're all going to hell and all this stuff. And there's a famous speech he wrote you can read called "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." Scare the hell out of you. But he was young, and he had a psychedelic side to him, and he would go into the forest and trip out on nature. And this raises the issue of ergot. Does anybody know what ergot is? Ergot is mushrooms, basically. A fungus, right? You're not on it right now, are you? What did you have for breakfast? Okay, so ergot is a known quantity, and it is a fungus that grew on badly stored rye. And so this grain, rye, that they would store, if it got wet, this fungus would grow, and the people who ate it would literally be on mushrooms. Now imagine in 1730 being on mushrooms. What the hell is going on? And you're going to hear this preacher who's talking about hell, and you're tripping your brains out. I mean, come on. A lot of people thought that this was the root of the witch trials, by the way. That in fact the hysteria in Salem in the 1690s was the result of ergot, badly stored grain. And they think it happened again in the 1730s and 40s, but it had a better impact. And in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is now a center of feminism, people were walking around tripping their brains out, and people were hugging each other, and there was rumors of free sex and all this other stuff, and they just came pouring out of the churches, and they had outdoor revivals where people would go absolutely crazy. I don't know how many of you have ever been to an evangelical outdoor rally, a tent like this, yelling and screaming and rolling in the aisles. I mean, it's fantastic. And amazingly enough, and I love this, this was the birth of jazz. Because what happened was, this is mind-boggling, but it's true, and there's literature about this. There were freed blacks in Massachusetts, and there are also blacks who were enslaved. And they would come, and these people, most of them came from Africa. The great irony of racism in America is that most black people in America trace their roots in America way earlier than most white people. Virtually every black person in America, their ancestors came here before 1808, which is when the slave trade was banned by the Constitution. But most white people, their ancestors, including mine, came here well after 1808. So in Massachusetts, in Western Mass, you had some free blacks and you had enslaved blacks. And they'd have these outdoor gatherings, these wild, evangelical love fests, and the blacks showed up with their drums. And when the hymnals were sung, the blacks would start drumming. This had never happened before. Drumming with hymnals was completely beyond the pale. When you get these letters from these preachers saying, holy shit, what's going on here? We're singing the hymnals, and all of a sudden there's this drumming. This is the birth of jazz. This is the birth of modern American music. One of the great cultural legacies of American music is jazz, the merger of black music, African music with white gospel music, hillbilly music, klezmer music, all these other things that came together in New Orleans. Their roots were way back in Massachusetts in the 1730s and 40s. And you also had exactly at this time, the Zenger case, the John Peter Zenger case. He was in New York, and this is another instance of feminism on the rise. John Peter Zenger was a German and he had an immigrant. He had a print shop in New York. He printed some pamphlets that were critical of the royal governor. He didn't write them, but they threw Zenger in jail, and they were going to persecute him. The governor was, it was a very complicated but a liberating thing. And what happened was his wife, while he was in jail, kept the presses going. And they grew, and by her keeping the presses going, there was a critical mass of a popular uprising, and they couldn't convict Zenger. And they actually, the people took over the jury and they acquitted him. And this is the basis of free speech in America, of the free press. Because after that, you were free. You could be sued, but you couldn't be convicted if what you printed was true. That wasn't the case before. If you criticized the royal governor, even if what you printed was true, they threw you away. But after the Zenger case, they couldn't do it anymore. And that is the whole basis of our free press. Comes right out of this great awakening in the 1730s and 40s. Now then, of course, it gets swallowed up, and the big push comes to be for revolution. And we have our revolution in the hot summer of the first cycle of our history. Our infant empire is born. And the revolution, of course, is a mixed bag, as are the founders, but never underestimate the power of the American Revolution. It was an extremely important event. It was the first anti-imperial revolution that ever happened. We were the first ones to overthrow an imperial power. We did it because we got the French on our side, but also, and this is really important, George Washington, the leader of and you know what he did, Washington was a slave owner, but he did free his slaves. He was also, amazingly enough, gay-friendly. I've written a novel that portrays George Washington as being a gay, pot-smoking Buddhist. He was probably none of the above, but it was a hell of a lot of fun to write. And it's inspired in part because he was tolerant. Gays were, forget it. You didn't discuss homosexuality in 1770s. But Washington hired a guy named Baron von Steuben to come train our army. And Baron von Steuben was openly gay, and he showed up at Valley Forge with a very young, very pretty young assistant, you know. And Washington came in and said, "Listen, man, this kid's underage. You can't keep him." But he didn't say anything about him being gay. And I'm going to tell you who else was gay: Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was actually bisexual. He had a wife and 8 kids. But in Valley Forge, he shacked up with a guy named John Lorenz, and there are love letters between the two of them. So you can draw your own conclusion. Of course, he was Jamaican. That explains everything, right? He was not a Rastafarian that we know, but you never can tell. So we have this revolution. We do free ourselves. We do get a Bill of Rights, and I got to tell you that the Bill of Rights, as far as I'm concerned, is the most important document ever written. You know, we had the Declaration, all men are created equal, from a slave owner, very complicated guy, Tom Jefferson. We had all these contradictions. We kept slavery. We conquered other people. We were terrible to the Indians. But the bottom line is that we won the revolution because George Washington had been an Indian fighter, and he killed a lot of Indians. There was a word for him among the Iroquois called destroyer of villages. But he learned how to fight like the Indians. We could never have beaten the British in a face-to-face imperial war. But we fought with indigenous tactics that Washington had won and adopted. And then, like I say, Franklin seduced the French, and that's how he won. It was an incredibly important moment, and that was our first summer, our first hot summer. And then we're followed by a reaction, which is the Constitution. Constitution, pretty reactionary document. It codified the power of the new post-colonial elite, right? Franklin, Washington, all these guys. The Constitutional Convention was basically 55 rich white guys. There are no women, there are no blacks, there are no farmers, no indigenous, and it was done in secret. If you showed up at the Constitutional Conventions, they had to go in and say hi to the guys. No, there were armed guards at the doors. And Washington presided for 4 months, never said a word, but he wore his uniform. So this is our reaction, the Constitution, and it's followed by a period of material decay. Jefferson comes in 1800. Everybody says Jefferson's going to be a big, revolutionary. He wasn't. He was more like Eisenhower than anybody else, and he actually started this on the road to empire. Washington and Adams understood that we couldn't go to war. They believed that we were superior. They believed in our imperial destiny, but they did not go off and conquer anybody else. We were just a squibby little, infant there. Jefferson, who was supposedly a small constitutionalist guy, he bought the Louisiana Purchase, which was unconstitutional, but it doubled the size of the United States. And you know, his idea, it was his idea, Jefferson was, to move the Indians. He bought in Louisiana in part. He wrote the Indians a letter in 1806 saying, hey, the Delaware saying, if you adopt our ways, if you have small farms, if you have a government, you know, you'll be fine. And then he bought Louisiana. He had already bought Louisiana and was planning to move them out. And our first imperial adventure was actually on the north coast of Africa. We had some trading going on, and there were pirates. And he sent our whatever navy we had to fight the pirates, and that was the shores of Tripoli. You know, the halls of Montezuma, the shores of Tripoli. That's when we fought the Barbary pirates, and then we conquered Mexico City, which I'll get to. So the period from 1800 to 1824 is called the era of good feelings. It was a materialistic period, and it was a wintertime. And we were interested in getting fat and getting rich, and people didn't care about politics and all that stuff, okay? The cycle starts the second time, a period of manifest destiny. In 1824, there had been a crash. We were in an economic depression, and Andrew Jackson, my second least favorite president, won the election of 1824, but it was stolen from him by John Quincy Adams. Adams had a terrible time, and then Jackson came in, and he formed the Democratic Party in 1828. It was a party of race and slavery all the way to the 1960s, with a little break in the 1930s in North, and we'll talk about that. But Jackson was a horrible guy. He fought 14 duels. He was a complete, not only was he a slave owner, he was a slave dealer. He moved slaves, you know, driving them with a whip to market. He made a lot of money selling slaves. And he is our new burst of energy. We decide we go off and start to conquer the whole continent. That was called Manifest Destiny. It was the idea that the whole North American continent belonged to us by right of God. And by God, that's what they did. His acolyte, James K. Polk, conquered the whole Southwest. You know, all this crap about immigration, people of Hispanic origin are just moving back into what was Mexico. You know, California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Oklahoma, Nevada, Colorado, parts of Wyoming. This was all, Utah, this was all part of Mexico. And we conquered it in the 1840s. So after Jackson comes in, we have this another great awakening, the transcendental period, very advanced, love of nature, Thoreau, Emerson, great feminism, the push of the feminists to get the right to vote, great literature, some drugs, some sex, and communes. There were actually hippie farms in the 1830s and 40s. All feeds into the abolitionist movement. The hot summer, again, is the Civil War. We abolish slavery. The reaction comes afterwards with the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow racism in the South, followed by a period of materialism, the Gilded Age, and then it starts again. In the 1890s, you have the rise of the populist movement, which unfortunately fails. If I explain it fully, we'll be here another hour. So you have and the rise of socialists. You have a great socialist leader, my hero, Eugene V. Debs, whose speech I'll be reading during the King presentation this afternoon between 3 and 6. The socialist movement and the populist movement, unfortunately, never quite get together. Had they joined, had there been an agrarian populist socialist movement, along with the hippie progressives who were called Bohemians at the time, we would have a very different country. But unfortunately, we get Teddy Roosevelt, who was a real warmonger, a very interesting guy, Teddy, real genius, actually. I have a certain respect for Teddy Roosevelt. And then Woodrow Wilson, who I despise beyond all measure. He was our very worst, most dictatorial president. He gets us into World War I, again in a hot summer. We had absolutely no business being in World War I. The vast majority of the American public opposed it. He used it as a cover to destroy the socialist movement. He put Eugene V. Debs in jail. He refused to let these guys out, and women who had opposed World War I, who were thrown in jail for 10 years. The armistice was in November of 1918. Most of these people were in jail for years and years after the war. It was terrible. That's called the Red Scare, and it was the most reactionary, most dictatorial time in all of U.S. history, and it's what pushed socialism out of the mainstream. You know, Eugene V. Debs was from Terre Haute, Indiana. He was an American born here. He was loved by millions and millions, and not until Bernie Sanders do you get another socialist who's out front. And Bernie Sanders, by the way, got 13 times as many votes as Eugene Debs is at his peak. So don't underestimate this. After that reaction, you get another winter time, the 1920s, very materialistic. You get another crash in 1929. In comes Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. Franklin would never have been president without Eleanor. We would have never had a New Deal without her. She was just a magnificent person, and he was pretty good. He was a complicated guy, but you remember he was in a wheelchair. And had he not had polio, he would never have had the depth of character to have done what he did. He was a master manipulator. We go through the New Deal, another great awakening, the populism of the 1930s. Populism, by the way, is a leftist phenomenon. I hate that they call these fascists populists. They're not populists. They're fascists. You know, populists are left-wingers who believe in social justice and women's rights and ecological preservation and all that stuff. Okay? So we have a populist uprising, another great awakening in the 30s. Again, we wind up with World War II. And, you know, it's a complicated phenomenon. David Swanson believes we should never have gotten involved. We were attacked. Did Franklin Roosevelt set it up? That's a complicated discussion. After World War II, at the peak of World War II, by the way, we reach our full adulthood. This is part of and we actually fulfill the Puritan dream of being in the city on the hill. We're the most powerful country the world has ever seen. We had full employment. We had women's rights, you know, Rosie the Riveter in the factories. If you were black, if you were Hispanic in 1943, 44, 45, you could get hired, no questions asked. After World War II, and of course we also, after World War II, we breeded like rabbits. You know, guys came home, stripped their wives, and 2.5 children. The baby boom is 76 million people, more people than there were in the United States in 1900. Our generation, right? So at least some of us, are the geezers now, we're baby boomers. And then in the 1950s, you get another reaction period. You have McCarthyism. You have a period of materialism. You have Eisenhower, although I actually like Eisenhower in many ways. And then the cycle starts again, 1957. There's a recession. In comes the greatest new burst of energy, John Kennedy. I happen to think John Kennedy would have been one of our very greatest presidents. He was a brilliant guy. He came in as a Cold Warrior. He got really his mind bent at the Bay of Pigs and at the Cuban Missile Crisis. The John Kennedy of 1963, the fall of 1963, at the time, the John Kennedy of November 21st, 1963 would have been our greatest and most progressive president, and that's why they killed him. And you can ask me about that. And those of you who are wondering who killed him, I'll tell you right now, it was Allen Dulles. Anybody disagree? And with Lyndon Johnson's approval. We'll proceed from there. So you have Vietnam, another hot summer, a horrible, horrible war. I mean, absolutely worthless, useless, no excuse whatsoever for that war. You have a period of reaction when Nixon tries to basically become a dictator. Nixon, by the way, like Donald Trump, was also a mafia guy. So we'll leave it at that for the moment. And then we have another period afterwards of materialism decay. There's a breakdown, Watergate. I loved every minute of Watergate, which is why I like what's going on now to a certain extent. And then in comes Jimmy Carter. He should have been another burst of energy. He was weak, and he didn't fulfill his promise. 1980, the October surprise, in comes Reagan. Reagan takes the world to the brink of nuclear extinction. He's a total reactionary. We have another period of materialism, and then the whole system comes down. In 1992, Clinton comes back. The cycle should have started again, but Clinton was totally corrupted. Clinton did two great things. He brokered the peace in Northern Ireland, thank God, and he put Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the court. Other than that, forget it. He was totally worthless. He's followed by another totally worthless George W. Bush. In comes Barack Obama. Barack Obama put those two great women on the court. He did Obamacare, but otherwise a terrible president. And really, basically, from 1992 on, we have ceased to be a separate entity because of the internet. We have ceased to be a vibrant democracy. Our democracy, as far as I'm concerned, died at the same time as Soviet communism. And now we're dealing with the Trumpocalypse. And that is 54 minutes. That is the history of the United States. And I am glad to take your questions. And thank you very much. That's the first time I've done it. I'm glad to hear you liked it. So yes, a question, please.
About bright vision of the future. Paint us a picture of the
Well, yes, the future. Paint us a picture of the lovely future. Well, we are back to the very bottom line where we started. We have the tiger and the lady, right? On the left hand, you've got our Puritan culture. Now, Trump is a parody of Puritanism, and yet the evangelicals stick with him. Why? Well, I'll tell you one reason. The obvious reason is money. When Lyndon Johnson was still a progressive and he was majority leader of the Senate, he pushed through what was called the Johnson Act, which prohibited nonprofits from being political. Those of us we know that in a nonprofit, you can't endorse a candidate. That applied to churches. When Trump came in, he said, that's an impingement of freedom of speech, as if he understands freedom of speech. And I'm not going to enforce the Johnson Act. All you churches, all you nonprofit churches, tax exempt, can endorse candidates now. So what has happened? The churches in this country, the evangelicals, the right-wing churches, are essentially money laundering machines for right-wing billionaires. They give their money to the churches. It's tax exempt, and the churches can now endorse candidates. That's the main reason the evangelical clergy sticks with Trump, because, of course they all do what he does with women and all that stuff, but he has now turned the churches into money laundering machines. And I will say this, that the big story now, and I've got one coming up in Reader Support News tomorrow, is this book by Craig Unger, House of Trump, House of Putin. Trump is and always has been a mafia guy. That is, forget about these tapes they have with him and all this other stuff. Putin owns him, lock, stock, and barrel financially. Trump's grandfather was a mafia guy. He ran a brothel in the gold country of California in the 1840s and 50s. He was a mob guy. Trump's father, Fred Trump, was a developer in New York City. You are not a developer in New York City without doing business with the five families. And he did business with two of them. I met at Jan's house David K. Johnston, who has been following Trump for 30 years. Trump inherited all this mob property from his father, couldn't manage it. He's a terrible businessman. In the mid-'90s, Donald Trump had $4 billion in debt and 6 bankruptcies. Who saved him? Well, what happened in the 1980s when the Clintons were selling the Democratic Party to the corporations, the New Democrats, and there ceased to be any significant difference between the parties, really. The Democrats are culturally a little more diverse, and the Republicans, of course, are not. But the money policies in the 1980s became the same, because Bill and Hillary Clinton formed the New Democrats, the Democratic Leadership Council. They joined. They didn't form that, but they were part of it. And they basically sold the Democratic Party to the corporations. And that's when American democracy essentially died, definitively. Now, what was happening in the Soviet Union was falling apart. And Stalin was but in the early days, Stalin put all these guys in the gulags, and they did not get out immediately after Stalin died. So in the gulags, what do you do when you're in a gulag and you're a young guy? You form organizations, and they got their tattoos. And when the Soviet Union fell, two things happened. All these guys got out of the gulag, and Putin came in after a brief time with Yeltsin, and he divided up the immense natural resources of the Soviet Union among these mafia groups that came out of the Soviet gulag. And that's who the oligarchs are in Russia, as these billionaires came out of the gulag and divided up the country and the oil, the gas, all the immense resources of the Soviet Union. Then they came here. And Trump, by the 90s, nobody would do business with him. Nobody would lend him money. He's $6 billion in debt, primarily because of the one casino he built in Atlantic City. Who does he go to? And who comes to him? The Russian mob. They had all this money, and they wanted to get it into the Western banking system. So they laundered their money through Trump's properties. What's the ideal thing to launder money? A condo. Trump did 1,300 condo deals with Russian mobsters in the 1990s. There's a famous scene. One of the Russian mobsters comes to him and plunks down $6 million and buys 5 condos in 721 Fifth Avenue, which is Trump Tower. Trump Tower is about a third occupied by Russian mobsters. So I don't want to buy into this Russian conspiracy stuff, but it happens to be true. And, you know, okay, if Hillary had gotten in, we might be at war with Russia by now. That's an improvement. The bottom line is, though, that Trump is owned lock, stock, and barrel by Putin. And there's a copy back there at the KPFK table of Oliver Stone's interviews with Putin. Putin is really smart. He actually knows history. Can you imagine that? And he's an extremely intelligent guy. He's an autarch. He wants to be a dictator, but he's a smart guy. Hitler wasn't stupid, So, and Trump is, as we know. Trump has one piece of magic that we cannot discount. He is a brilliant, brilliant entertainer. And every night, these guys go for it. Rachel and Don Lemon and all these other guys in MSNBC and CNN, they're up there night after night after night ranting at Trump. I mean, come on, we know already what the deal is. There's no mystery here. What about the environment? What about the school system? What about the public housing they're selling off? What about all this other stuff? Trump is just like, look at me, look at me, look at me. And it's been working. But he is a Russian operative. And so we don't want to go to war with them. It's not the fault of the Russian people. He's a mobster. That's all he is. He's the Manchurian mobster. Nixon was also a mobster, by the way. None of the other presidents, we don't see, a little bit with Reagan, but we don't see the organized crime connection until we really get to Nixon. And then in comes Trump, who's definitely owned by them. Other questions? Yes, sir. Your check's in the mail. My books are all $10. This is my original history of the U.S. This is what I looked like back then. That's why I call myself Sluggo. I actually had some baseball ability back then. I find the older I get, the better I was. And this one's at 2 o'clock is our panel on election theft with Mimi Kennedy and John Brakey. And we're going to talk about, because all this was the death of American democracy has been facilitated by election theft. And it was started by George H.W. Bush. In 1988, Bush ran against Dole. He was behind in the polls, and he miraculously won. And we know he flipped the machines. And this was stuff, talk about vultures come home to roost. The art and science of election theft was pioneered by the CIA, which is our imperial organ. And they perfected it, and H.W. Bush, Bush 1, was the master of election theft. And he stole the 88 election primary, and then he stole 2000, where he showed his son, W, and Rove and Cheney were Bush 1 guys. They were actually Nixon guys. And they stole 2000, they stole 2004. They stole in 2010, they completely gerrymandered the country with Koch money, and Obama said not a word. And then in 2016, Hillary Clinton just rolled over and let them steal the election. So the whole death of American democracy, dating to really 1988 and through the Clinton years, is built on election theft, which we have to correct. Small deal.
We have a question here.
Please.
I think that
Talk in.
The civil rights movement, is it?
Yes.
The civil rights movement was under JFK and a little bit before JFK. So maybe that's where you're including it.
Yes.
But I think you have to have a box there because...
a what?
A separate box right next to that or something.
Well, here, let's talk about...
Yeah, because it really needs to be mentioned because all the rights came from that.
Many of them. Can we switch? I have another slide there. Sharon's gone.
Okay.
I have a snake slide. Keep going. The thing you have to understand about the cycles is that they have gotten shorter. And the civil rights movement is inseparable. Well, let me talk about race in this country real quick, okay? When blacks and whites were coming to America in the 1600s as indentured servants, there was no racism. I know this is hard to comprehend. Racism was invented in the 15 and 1600s to justify two things: empire and slavery. Keep going. There's a snake. You'll see it. Keep going. Of course, it's the last one. There we go. Can you make that full screen? So in 1670, and indigenous people, the blacks and the whites were not great to the Indians, but they were fine with each other. I know this is hard to comprehend, but blacks and whites until 1675 in North America got along pretty well. They worked together, they intermarried, they had children together, and it was fine. But in 1675, there was an uprising. It was called Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon was a real jerk of a cavalier. He was a slave owner, and he didn't like the governor, whose name was Berkeley, and he didn't like the governor because the governor wasn't killing enough Indians. That's literally the case. So he pulled a rebellion of black and white indigenous, indentured servants. And then they burned Jamestown to the ground, and Governor Berkeley had to run away, the whole deal. So the slave owners came to the conclusion that the last thing they ever wanted again to have happen was to have black and whites unify. And so they invented slavery, not so much as a labor system, because there's a big argument whether slavery really was economically viable. A lot of people think slavery really was a money loser, and you can make that case. But they did it because they wanted blacks to be separated from whites so that they never again united. And so it was not a class system, it was a caste, C-A-S-T-E system. And blacks were made an inferior caste, and they were decreed to be genetically inferior. And after 1675, as opposed to before, blacks had zero rights. I mean zero rights. You could torture, rape, sell, and murder a black slave with zero legal ramifications. And so it was a very calculated decision to separate blacks and whites. And ever since then, every awakening period has had an attempt of blacks to get their own, to re-emerge from the caste system of slavery. During the Revolution, the American Revolution, the Brits went and they said, okay, all you black slaves, we will give you your freedom if you will fight for us. And Washington, who was a slave owner, had to agree. And so in the American Revolution, there was 20% of the American army was black. And 50,000 blacks got their freedom in the American Revolution. Then, prior to the Civil War, you had the abolitionist movement. All these transcendentalists believed in black equality, and you had Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, and the women's rights movement was very much involved and came out of the abolitionist movement. And so that was a civil rights movement. After the Civil War, you did get a civil rights bill in 1875, which was thrown out by the court. We done? Yeah, okay. And is the trapdoor going to fall, or should I just, anyway. That's part of the civil rights. Before World War I, you had a big civil rights movement. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and then during the New Deal, again, A. Philip Randolph was always threatening Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was not great. The Democrats were not great with black people during the New Deal. It was a shanda. It was not good what happened. And then of course in the 1960s, and what really happens is after World War II, when you had the blacks coming back, there was some movement by the blacks, veterans after World War I, but after World War II, they really wouldn't take any shit anymore. And then really you get the birth of the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s when you get Brown versus Board of Education, and you get the black veterans who are just not going to take it anymore. And unfortunately, you're not going to be able to take me anymore. This was really fun. Thank you so much for letting me do this.
Let's give him a big hand.
I appreciate it. I'll sign your book. And there's a sheet going around. If you give me your email address, I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dick and Sharon. And please, I'm done. Thank you so much.
All right, let's give him another hand. That was very informative.
Oh.